The ambassador moved with deliberate steps, his rugged frame contrasting sharply with the refined opulence surrounding him, the air heavy with the fragrance of exotic incense. Courtiers adorned in silks exchanged disdainful glances as the envoy approached the throne. The grandeur of the throne room was a testament to the empire's immense wealth. Gilded columns soared towards an intricately painted dome, depicting scenes of imperial glory. Elaborate mosaics adorned the marble floor, their vibrant hues reflecting the empire's cultural richness. The throne itself, a marvel of craftsmanship, was encrusted with jewels that sparkled like distant stars. Perhaps the emperor was indeed a god. And what could he, a man born in a humble tent, offer to a god? He gathered his remaining strength and prepared to offer peace terms. In today's video, we will take a look at the famous Byzantine diplomacy and espionage system, as well as the geopolitical situation and overall imperial grand strategy that contributed to the empire's millennium-long lifespan. This video was sponsored by our kind YouTube members and patrons. Becoming a YouTube member or patron is the best way to support our work, so we're now providing our supporters with exclusive videos to thank them. Join their ranks to watch the Pacific War series, alongside the First Punic War, Sulla's biography, the Italian War of Unification, Risorgimento, the Russo-Japanese War, Albigensian Crusade, History of Prussia, and much more. 80 or so exclusive videos in total. In 2024, YouTube members and patrons will watch series on the fall of Sparta, the Reconquista, Second Punic War, Spanish War of Succession, and Russian Civil War, and will continue getting early access to all videos, access to an exclusive Discord server, will know our schedule, and vote on future videos. YouTube member and patron support allows us to keep the majority of our videos free in a world where YouTube monetization income is very uneven. If you want to support our work, join their ranks today via the link in the description and pinned comment. Thank you. On the 11th of May 330, Constantine the Great, having reunited the war-torn Roman lands, officially consecrated the new capital of his empire, the New Rome, or as it quickly became known, Constantinople. The city, situated on the crossroads of two continents, enjoyed some unparalleled geostrategic advantages, mainly significant importance as a central trade hub. The city was also easily defendable, surrounded on three sides by the sea. It also served as the empire's second major administrative center, closer to its eastern provinces, which were of greater economic value. However, Constantinople and her provinces also faced many disadvantages, most notably the lack of strategic depth and unfavorable geography. For most of its long life, the Byzantine Empire faced enemies from at least three directions, enemies who were quite often stronger militarily and used radically different ways to conduct warfare, making the adoption of a single method of fighting impossible for the Byzantines. China, another long-lived empire, had natural barriers such as impassable mountain ranges, jungles, and deserts, protecting it from most sides, with the only real outside threats coming from the north. Byzantium, on the other hand, had none of these defenses, especially when the northern borders were moved from the speed bump that was the Danube River. Even its western counterpart was in a geographically more advantageous position, with the natural shield of the Alps and safe inland provinces such as Iberia, whereas the eastern half's most important province, Asia Minor, was under constant threat from outside enemies from the east and south. Perhaps not coincidentally, these foes, the Sassanids, the Arab Caliphates, and the Turks, were the most significant threats the empire would face. In the past, Rome employed a different type of strategy to defend its enormous borders against the various barbaric tribes that threatened the Imperium, that of raw strength. A vast standing army, a military machine with no equals in the ancient world, was stationed near the empire's borders. It was this strength of arms and the fear it inspired that kept Rome's enemies at bay. However, this strategy would not be viable indefinitely, as it put too much of a strain on the imperial coffers. Instead, Byzantium would rely on a different grand strategy based on diplomacy and roundabout means of dealing with their adversaries. Containment, not destruction, was the preferred method of dealing with the empire's adversaries. This was a very Roman and pragmatic approach to the subject, for the Byzantines knew that today's enemies could be tomorrow's allies, and vice versa. Famous examples include Justinian pitching the Gepids and the Lombards against each other to contain the threat these two Germanic tribes posed for the empire, and the tributes paid to the Huns, though the latter mainly stemmed from the inability of the Eastern Roman armies to face the Hunnic horse archers in open battle. This approach should not be mistaken for weakness and a lack of military strength on the empire's behalf. The Eastern Romans could still use hard power when necessary, but generally speaking, the Byzantines preferred to win their conflicts without bloodshed, a tactic that echoed Sun Tzu's famous sheathed sword. Perhaps the greatest Byzantine general in history, Belisarius, seems to have averted an entire Sassanid invasion during the spring of 542 using trickery. When Khosrow I invaded Byzantine Syria to raid the land, Belisarius moved into the area with a much smaller force of around 6,000 men, largely consisting of Goths and Gepids, and positioned his army in such a way as to threaten the Persian flank. Khosrow, who couldn't gamble his advance into enemy territory with his rear exposed, sent an ambassador to assess the strength of the Byzantine forces. Belisarius, knowing the ambassador's true purpose, ordered his men to make their numbers look bigger by moving constantly and lighting more fires at night. The trick worked, and the Persians preferred to retreat rather than risking an engagement or prolonging their encampment in the area, out of fear of catching the plague. Belisarius kept applying pressure to the retreating Sassanid forces, who sacked a few towns and crossed the Euphrates back into their homeland. The Sassanids posed a serious threat to the empire, as they were also an advanced and organized civilization, able to conduct warfare in the same way the Byzantines were. Complex army logistics, lengthy sieges against fortified cities, and cunning espionage and diplomacy were not out of the Persians' capabilities, so Maurice, in his Strategikon, advised caution when fighting them. But just as the Byzantines were fearful of their eastern neighbours, so too were the Sassanids wary of the well-disciplined Roman heavy infantry ranks. Despite the Byzantines successfully recognizing Persian weakness on the field of battle, mainly their commitment to tight formations and susceptibility to flanking attacks, the two empires were so close in terms of power that during the Great Wars of the 7th century, they fought themselves almost to the point of total collapse. Taking advantage of their exhaustion, the Arabs, spurred on by their new religion, spread out of their peninsula, conquering large parts of former Byzantine territory and completely bringing down the former Sassanid juggernaut. The Arabs, replacing the Persians, would be the main rival of the Imperium from the 8th century onwards, at least until the advance of the Seljuk Turks into Asia Minor. This new enemy fought in a different manner, and compelled the Byzantines to switch their defensive strategy. Border conflict, especially raids, became the norm between the Byzantines and the Saracens. Even smaller scale raids, however, could be pretty dangerous, and they still required the drafting of thematic soldiers to deal with them. These thematic soldiers were partially warriors and partially farmers, and as such could not abandon their homes for an extended period of time, so the empire adopted an elastic defense doctrine, allowing a few incursions here and there and focusing on blocking the narrow passages to prevent the enemies from getting inland to untouched and richer territory. With the usage of spies, the Byzantines were able to accurately predict when and where the enemy would amass and set up their defences accordingly, forcing the raiders to either look for another route to circumnavigate the obstacles or abandon their expedition altogether. However, this strategy was rather costly because of the number of spies and professional troops that needed to be employed alongside the thematic troops to redirect the Saracen raids. In addition, the Arabs had their own spies and would know beforehand whether or not the Byzantines were ready to intercept them and could redirect their attack to a different sector or call it off. They could even do a little bit of trolling by keeping their forces in the area, forcing the Byzantines to keep their own thematic soldiers under arms. Thus, the Byzantines developed an alternative reactionary strategy, where instead of trying to prevent the incursions, which was almost impossible, they allowed them to raid deep into imperial territory and then trapped the enemy forces inside. The raiders, encumbered by the additional weight of the loot they had collected and the prisoners they had taken, moved slowly, and thus the Byzantine troops enjoyed significant tactical advantages. It was also easier and cheaper for the imperial war machine to draft troops reacting to the raid, instead of calling them in anticipation of the attack. In this way, they could more accurately predict the route the enemy's columns would follow, and which forces needed to be mobilized. Victories following this stratagem include those of Leo Phocas and Ioannis Zimisces against Saif al-Dawla in 950 and 958 respectively, and the Battle of Helion and Lymokia in 1177 against the Seljuks. Not forgetting the tactics developed during the time of Leo the Wise, the Byzantine army, led by John Komnenos Vatatzes, ambushed the Seljuk forces near the villages of Helion and Leimokia that were returning home after having successfully raided as far as the seashore of the Aegean. The Byzantines crushed the Seljuks as they crossed a bridge, achieving a victory of significant psychological importance, as the year before they had suffered a devastating defeat at the Battle of Myriokephalon. But what about the civilian population of the borders that was plagued by those constant raids? The raiders were primarily aiming for cities that had enough plunder for them to justify the amount of time and effort they had invested in this campaign. Villages that could only yield cattle, crops, and slaves were simply not worth it, especially since the people living there went the extra mile and fortified them too. These villages were intentionally built high upon mountains, with houses forming walls and narrow alleys, and their denizens preferred cattle, which in the event of a raid could be hidden, or had crops that were harvested in spring, long before the summer raids. Naturally, the strategy wasn't waterproof, and eventually the population of these areas got tired of the constant raids, abandoning the region and undermining the strength of the local thematic armies. Let us further elaborate on the usage of spies the Byzantines employed to receive information about the movements of their adversaries. Indeed, espionage was one of the pillars the empire relied upon for its survival. Throughout its millennium-spanning life, with the exception perhaps of its twilight years, the Imperium enjoyed information superiority over its enemies thanks to the extensive intelligence network it was able to cast. Byzantium had the ability to send cultured and educated men to faraway lands, where they mingled with the population and acquired vital info. Tasked with intelligence gathering and analysis, as well as counter-espionage, these men gave Byzantium the upper hand, both in military operations and diplomacy. Their ranks, numbered in the thousands during the Byzantine-Sassanid Wars, showcase the reliance and importance the empire placed on them. Perhaps the wildest and most famous example of their activity does not concern matters of war, but rather industrial espionage, perhaps the first in the world. Around the year 550, Emperor Justinian sent Nestorian monks to China to steal silkworm eggs, which they hid inside their hollowed-out canes and brought them back to Greece. The local silk production brought less than the desired results, and Byzantine gold continued to flow through the Silk Road eastwards, yet it did provide a new source of revenue for the empire. Of course, regular border monitoring and intelligence gathering were less adventurous but far more paramount for the empire's survival. Crucial for this were the akritae, men who lived on the far edges of the Imperium and guarded the borders, similar to the older Roman limitani. They were tasked with constantly surveying the enemy's land, and if possible, befriending some of the foreigners, especially disaffected officials, who due to their rank could reveal more. They would often inform Constantinople of their findings through the public postal service, the cursus publicus, and especially by using a highly sophisticated Frictoria system, a beacon system similar to the one Gondor uses in Lord of the Rings. The astonishing speed by which news travelled across the land can be seen in the way Basil the Bulgar Slayer, informed of a Saracen attack against Aleppo, quickly abandoned his campaign against the Bulgarian Tsar Samuel, crossed the land in the middle of winter, and within 16 days he was personally leading the Byzantine forces in Syria. The usage of spies when the Byzantine armies were marching into foreign lands did not differ that much from what any sane commander would do. That is, they employed light and fast-mounted foot scouts that infiltrated the lands a few days in advance to gather info and report back to the commander about the strength and position of the enemy. These men were also encouraged to capture and imprison foreign troops, and through torture, collect further intel. A trick the Byzantines also employed was getting intentionally captured, and once questioned by the enemy, supplying him with lies and false information to confuse him. Besides spies, gathering intel, spreading misinformation and hostility among the enemy was something another type of agent could also accomplish, the diplomat. Not enough can be said about the art of Byzantine diplomacy, which became an example for future imperial powers to follow. But the empire's diplomatic corps was a significant factor that contributed to its longevity. This was an era with no permanent embassies and ambassadors, not to mention nomadic tribes that didn't even have permanent cities of their own, so delegations were sent when the need arose. Nonetheless, the Byzantines selected their diplomats with great care. Educated and cultured people were selected, outgoing men with an affinity for languages, respected for their dignity. Most importantly, they ought to be willing to travel to distant lands and risk their lives for the empire, as such a journey was often dangerous. Armed with extensive knowledge about the people they were visiting, and of course collecting their own on their stay, these men used every trick imaginable to ensure the empire's survival and dominance. Bribery, misinformation, alliances, trade agreements, marriage proposals, and divide and conquer stood at the forefront of Roman politics ever since the days of the Republic. This strategy was especially effective against the tribes of the north, so much so that Anna Komnene notes that her father's failure to spread hostility among the Pechenegs was highly unusual. Christian missionaries and Christianity in general were also used as part of Byzantium's diplomatic arsenal. Missionaries such as Cyril and Methodius, who were famous for evangelizing the Slavs and creating the Cyrillic alphabet, courageously ventured far into unknown and often hostile territory, and collected much knowledge about the customs and manners of the people there, so they were extremely useful in delegations. The Christianization of their neighbours, while not eliminating the threat entirely, did lower the chances of hostility, as the two people were now spiritually bound. But it wasn't only Byzantium that sent diplomats and delegations to other people. In fact, the opposite would have been far easier, since the empire had an established capital, and Constantinople was the diplomatic chessboard where the emperor would win the game. A foreign diplomat who came to have the chance to talk to the emperor would come face to face with all the imperial splendor, prestige, and wealth of the capital. Dazzling clothes, expensive utensils, a strict protocol, and most strikingly of all, next to the throne there were medieval automata of golden birds that moved their wings and tweeted, and lions that wagged their tails and roared. All these served the same purpose, to remind the ambassador of the difference in status between the Byzantine emperor and the monarch he served. Faced with this tremendous exhibition of wealth, power, and cultural superiority, any visitor would indeed be charmed. Famous is the example of Vladimir of Kiev's envoys, who visited Constantinople and were so impressed by the Hagia Sophia that they reported to him, "We knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth, for surely there is no such splendor or beauty anywhere on earth. We cannot describe it to you. We only know that God dwells there among men, and that their service surpasses the worship of all other places." Following this, Vladimir the Great was baptized and took the emperor's sister as a wife. Through soft power, Byzantium had turned a potential pagan threat into a steady Christian ally. This was the epitome of Byzantine persuasion and grand strategy, turning foes into friends. The empire, which could not face the dozens of enemies that surrounded it on the field of battle, had found a new and more effective way to deal with its foes. More videos on diplomatic, social, and political history are on the way. To ensure you don't miss them, make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting, and sharing, it helps immensely. Recently, we've started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video. To watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.